Welcome back for the last part of our conversation. I don't think we could have this conversation without directly addressing the issue of COVID and the moment of collective trauma that we find ourselves in. Not only has this forced so many museums to move into these unknown virtual spaces, but just the collective trauma that all of our audiences are going through is something that I don't know if it feels right to say unprecedented, but it feels unprecedented in my lifetime. And so, in our conversation, we've been talking a lot about the ways that you've been creating programs in this virtual environment. But I'm wondering if you might share with us just some key takeaways from this moment that you will bring with you when we're all back live into museums, engaging with objects firsthand. Like, what has this experience taught you, both in terms of thinking about this collective trauma, but also this like peculiar way of doing museum education through Zoom?
Well, I'll say that coming from an incredibly privileged position, I think the first thing that I understood about myself is how privileged I am to be alone in a large apartment, because moving from the East Coast to Cleveland presented a whole host of real estate gifts, manna from heaven. But but considering what it, but also the opportunity to expand what people know of the collection, because we can show things that aren't on view. Expanding accessibility. I will always want whatever I am creating in the galleries to be either recorded, to have an ASL interpreter, to have the ability. I will never forget to do visual descriptions again. There are ways in which my own skills as an educator have been really refined because of having to shift really dramatically and quickly to a virtual platform. And so I think that also thinking about things, it's opened the museum to these, I think, practices, like having something where art objects are at the center, but we have a series called Desktop Dialogues, where the most recent one was our facilitator in conversation with a meditation specialist and her developing meditations out of that. Or I had the privilege of co-moderating a series of teach-ins with Latanya Autry called The Art of Collective Care, handling images of Black trauma and death, in which we had Dr. Amy Cox, who is a professor, but also a meditation specialist, grounding us in meditation multiple times over those, so that we have these moments of respite. And I'll leave it there. So it's creating these rituals of self-care, but also thinking about what can be generated by these moments of trauma, that they are always constantly generative, even as rather than foreclosing.
Also, maybe the importance, what I feel I've learned, or maybe has been sort of forcefully reinforced as a method of thinking, is the importance of listening. And not just, I mean, and let me rephrase that. It's listening, but it's like taking a beat to listen, taking a pause to listen, right? And before we act. And I do struggle with sort of the balance of when do you sit on something too long, or when are you taking too long to actually act, that it's like the listening or the pause, what's the word I'm looking for? Like stunts the progress, or just sort of keeps you paralyzed. That's what I was looking for. Keeps you kind of paralyzed. And I don't want to get to that point, but the importance of, I think when I think about sort of, coming out of the murder of George Floyd, and I still cringe when I think about those black square moments, and just sort of and I get it. I get the need to sort of respond and to do things, but like, when do you need to listen, and who do you need to listen to, so that you can respond effectively, so that you can be given your marching orders, for lack of a better term. But I think about, like, so I went to there was a block maybe 5 blocks away from me that was had quite a violent explosion during one of the protests following the death of George Floyd. I happened to be driving through right as it was kind of starting, and just very intense, something I've never actually witnessed in person before, in terms of like armored cars coming up and down the street and like smoke and fire and all that sort of stuff. I went to the cleanup the day afterwards. I went to the cleanup in the morning, and what was sort of a powerful moment to me was when people showed up with cleaning supplies and then kind of stood on the corner waiting for the people whose businesses it was, whose community it was, to say what they needed or to direct them where to go. And that was kind of like, what does it mean to sort of put yourself in a situation to be helpful? I don't know if this connection is making sense to anyone else, but I think that's like what I feel like is an important practice when I think about the role that we can play in these conversations. I think there's a lot of resources and tools we have, and I think it's important to listen to our communities about how we deploy those tools and resources, or to point out the resources that we don't even necessarily think of are the tools and resources that we have. That it's not about us deciding necessarily where they go. It's about being shown that direction.
For me, I fear that these reveal that I have not been practicing as the best museum education that I could in the past, but I'll just say that to echo Damon, these are practices that have been, I guess, that call me to reinforce them rather than new. But to go back to our previous discussion about like all the people in the Zoom room with their mics off and their cameras off, like those people also are in our galleries. And of course, I think especially when we're thinking about K through 12, we think about nonverbal ways of communicating and obviously multimodal education. And we can do that, people do that with adults as well. I guess I had taken for granted the facility with language, and I use that too much. I think now I realize that I've been over relying on dialogue when facilitating conversations with adults. And now that I've had a chance to learn a little bit more about trauma-informed practice, understanding that trauma is pre-verbal. And so the best way to like support it is actually with nonverbal forms of engagement. And so there's a great article that I'll, I guess, share the link to, but they recommend passing, note cards around. And obviously these are things that people do, pre-COVID, but I guess I had reframed it now. Like, oh yeah, it was so great when we had the chat. Like, is there a way of reproducing the chat by like making, having people write things down on note cards. So it's not about speaking, it's about like writing and then having the facilitator like share out, or other ways to like offer different ways of engaging without necessarily putting everybody, like assuming that everybody has the same level of comfort in terms of being in a group. Again, this is not new practice, but it was a learning for me in a new way. And then the other, again, I have to say that, as a person who started as an art historian, I still sort of love sharing the facts. and so this program has really taught me so much about privileging connection over like what we used to think about as content, And so I've just enjoyed so much thinking about, well, how does this artwork make sure that everybody can say something to one another, as opposed to, oh, I need to say, this is explain this art historical concept, or I need to make sure that I share this artist quote. Sometimes that means sharing an artist quote, but for like a different reason. So those are my learnings.
Maybe one thing that I've observed in seeing my colleagues in other museums as well is just, I guess, seeing institutions recognize how important art educators are, and seeing the bulk of the work kind of fall on our shoulders, really, even as our departments continue to be cut and our resources continue to be cut as well. And I hope that is something that sticks with our leaders, and that they continue valuing the work that we do.
I'm sorry, just to that end, could I just please acknowledge the gallery teachers at the Cleveland Museum of Art, because they are the ones who do the lion's share of our public teaching. As administrator, my role inside of the galleries, the more and more my role shifts, the less and less time I get to spend in the gallery. So, and those were the spaces that have been hardest hit in general. And so when we're thinking about how we are rebuilding, or thinking about these existential questions with museums, I think we have to put educators at the center of those conversations, because I think what museums are seeing, to Gabriela's point, is they are what make the audience engaged. They are who really are drawing those audiences in. The curatorial brilliance, of course, is part of that, but that education, that intellectual think tank that we have in our gallery teachers shouldn't be unsung.
Just want to lift that up. That's it. Just agreeing and lifting that up.
So thank you all so much. This was such an engaging conversation. You've given us so much to think about, whether we're gallery teachers, whether we're working in museum education departments, or whether we're working in universities. So many ways that you guys are engaging with your communities in such incredible and important, distinct ways. So thank you so much.